Hello, my name is Julie, and today we are going to be talking about my 2024 reading stats. I love stats, I love spreadsheets, I love graphs, I love charts, and I have been making my own reading spreadsheet since the end of 2019, and every year I've revamped it, so it is time to look at my year end of 2024. I am going to be making a new version in 2025, and you will get a little tour of that when I do that, but today is still about 2024 reading, so we can get a better look at what my reading looked like in 2024, and also, if you're a person who wants to keep track of your reading like this, you can get some ideas, or even if you want to have the spreadsheet that I have, I actually sell this on Etsy. It is $5 for the spreadsheet that I made. The 2024 sheet is what is currently on my Etsy. I haven't finished my 2025 sheet, but you will be the first to know when I do. But without further ado, let's look into my stats. This is my reading spreadsheet. I have so many tabs down here of stuff that I do to get a bunch of stats, but we're going to start out with my annual stats. So overall, looking at the year, I read 147 books in 2024, which I think is pretty incredible. Like, I don't know how I did it. I ended up reading 56,446 pages in 2024. I've never done that before, oh boy. I cannot expect to do more than that ever if I continue to have a full-time job. My average rating was a 3.63, which is higher than it has been in previous years, but we're gonna talk about why that stat might be a little bit misleading later in the video. I think it's actually really interesting. My average page count for a book was 383.99, and my median page count was 360. For hours listened, this is my audiobooks, I estimate this by the length of the book rather than inputting the hours of the audiobook, which I have my estimate as 689.9. Given that I listen to most audiobooks on 2-speed and I drive 30 minutes back and forth from work, that makes sense. The month in which I read the most, which it's most books and tie breaks are done by pages, was in August. The month that I rated the books highest was May. I'm gonna tell you, May was fantastic. I think I had 3 different 5 stars. The genre that I read the most was fantasy. The highest rated genre I had was historical fiction, but we'll see why in a minute. And I ended up hauling a total of 71 books, both books that I had not and had read before, physical and audiobook. The longest books I read, I talked about this in my Bookshelf Wars video, but the top ones were Rhythm of War, Lord of Chaos, and The Burning White. My shortest books read actually has changed since that last video because I squeezed in one more book at the end of the year. So my shortest were Graveyard Shift, The Blue Book of Nebo, which is the new one, and What Feasts at Night. My most read authors, I had one author that I read 3 books from, which was Brandon Sanderson, and then I had, I think, 7 or 8 authors that I read 2 from. Holly Jackson and S.T. Gibson are just some of those. These 3 right here are actually my reading challenges that I got done throughout the year, and you see them all being completed because I finished all of them. So now the genre breakdown. One thing that is a little bit weird about me is that I have split general fiction into general fiction and speculative fiction because I wanted a better idea if the books that I was picking up that were considered general fiction were like magical realism or fabulism type books. I'm not sure if I want to do that in the future. We'll see. And also this year I changed my policy on classics. I now include modern classics as classics, but I ended up reading 15 general fictions that were realistic fiction. I read 42 fantasy books, 15 science fiction, 31 mystery thriller horror, 12 speculative books, 14 romance books, 4 historical fictions. So you can see I had a high average rating because I only read 4 books that were all like very well acclaimed. I read 5 classics and 9 nonfictions, which is more nonfictions than usual. For demographic breakdown, I had 130 adult books, which means I had 17 young adult. For acquisition year, this is the year that I got the book. This does include all of the audiobooks that I bought this year, which I only purchased audiobooks and then listened to them immediately. Like, definitely if you exclude those, which should be like 12 of those books, I definitely read more books that I acquired in the previous year than any other group. And the 2020 to 2022, I have 10 books down there and 3 books that I had before 2020. That number is totally dwindling, but I would love to just not have that category anymore and read all of the books that I've had since then. Then we have the date that the book was published. Hi, editing Julie here. I actually made a mistake with this graph, so this is the correct one. Brand new means that it is a book released from 2023 to 2024, and that was 40% of my reading, which I think is higher than normal. I feel like I was buying a lot of new releases, especially with my book boxes, and also I was trying to purposefully read stuff for the Goodreads Awards, so this makes sense. Recent releases are the last 5 years prior to 2023. Backlist is stuff since 1990, modern classic is 1900 to 1990, and classic is before 1900. Then we have my star ratings in quarter stars. I do rate my books on my spreadsheet in quarter stars. I only started doing this last year. We'll talk more about it later. But you can see at the bottom, we have no rating and DNF, starting down at 1 and going up all the way to 5. My no ratings are almost entirely nonfiction books. There's a couple 1s, a couple 2s, whole lot of 3s. There are more 3s than any other category, and second most is 3.5s. I had a 3 heavy year, which is a little sad. And I had 15 proper 5 stars, which I'm not too mad about. For mediums, I read 91 books physically. I read 3 books on ebook, and I read 53 books on audiobook. That's pretty consistent that I almost always read about a third of my books on audio. 66 of the books that I read were books that I owned. Books from the library were 76 of my books. That's over half of my reading, which is great. I had 2 books that I got from NetGalley, and I had 3 books that I borrowed. I think one of those books I borrowed from another physical human being, and then the other 2 were books that were included in my Audible subscription. So I did not actually purchase them. It comes with my thing. So like if I got rid of my Audible, I would no longer have the book. So I'm counting it as being borrowed. We have representation in the books that I read. So 60 of the books that I read had people of color and queer characters on the page. 28 of them had people of color, 17 of them had queer characters, and 42 of them had neither or neither that I could discern. Then we have star ratings whole stars. So we saw quarter stars before, now we have whole stars. 16 books were 5 stars or rounded to 5 stars, 54 stars, 59 3 stars, don't love that, 12 2 stars, and 3 1 stars, which means I only had 1 more 5 star than 2 or 1, which I don't love. Now we have my favorite little graphic right here. This is about my TBR and my collection as a whole, and the money behind that. So I read 66 books from my TBR this year, that's physical and audio, and I added 64 books to my TBR. I also unhauled 4 books for my TBR. So that means I have an annual net TBR of -6. I was doing so well until December. At the end of November, I had -19, but I got so much in December between sales, used bookstores, and Christmas that I went back to pretty much 0. I don't have that much of a TBR problem, but I would like that number to be in the negatives for right now. Then we have the same thing, but for my collection. So not about what I've read, just about all of the books that I own. I removed 29 books from my collection. I added 68 books to my collection. That means my collection increased by 39 books, again, including audiobooks, which I can't really get rid of. Then we can see the money I spent on my collection. I estimate that I spent $573 myself on my collection, but value added to my collection, which I have estimated with the current retail prices I could find from places like Barnes & Noble, was $1,430. So between people buying me things and sales, I spent 50% of what a book's retail price would be. I also estimate how much money I saved by using the library. I do this by estimating what the price of a book should be using the age of the book and the medium that I read it in, and I estimate that by using my library, I saved $1,379. I got $83 back from selling some of my old books, so I do have a storefront on Pango. If you would like to buy books that I'm trying to get rid of, you can go check those out, and I also have sold to my used bookstore. Then we have my series and standalones. 93 of the books that I read this year were considered standalones, or I consider them to be standalones at least. 19 of them were first books in series, 16 of them were sequels, 7 of them were conclusions, and 3 of them I decided to count as companions rather than sequels. I don't know if I want to continue doing that. Recommendation sources. Where did I hear about this book from? Why am I reading it? The biggest category is going to be author in series. These are books from authors that I have already loved, or it's sequels. That was 50 of my books. 15 of my books I read from just picking them up on a whim. I hadn't really heard anybody actually recommending the book. Then 35 of the books were from the bookish community. I had seen a good amount of people praising this book. 9 of them were from specific book influencers like my favorite booktubers. 12 of them were personal recommendations to me from people who know me. 6 of them were specifically for a book club. I was not going to pick this book up now otherwise. 6 of them were solely because they were a review copy. 6 of them because they were classics. And in 8 of them I said other. Then we have the books read per page range. I had an exactly even number of books under 200 pages and books over 600 pages, which is a nice symmetry. But the most common we know is going to be 300 to 350. That's the usual length of a novel. Then we have my medium by ownership and ownership by medium. These are the same 2 things, just flipped. So you can see of the owned books that I read this year, most of them were physical books, some of them were audio. Library books, I actually got more audiobooks than physical books, just by 1. Then for physical books, I owned a little bit more than half of the books that I read, and for audiobook, way more of them were from the library. And we have some ARC stats. 137 books were not ARCs, and 10 of them were. 8 of them were physical books, and 2 of them were ebooks from NetGalley. And then last on this sheet is the read status of my books hauled. I got like 25 books in December, so I should expect the unread pile to be the biggest. That makes sense. 4 of them I actually read before I acquired them, and 25 I have read since I acquired them this year. Let's go over to possibly my most interesting page. This is not on the spreadsheet that I have published to Etsy because it is tied to my own reading over the course of years. It would require a lot more data input from the people who would be using it. I do not know if it is going to be included in my 2025 one. If it does, the 2025 one is going to take longer. This is my reading over the course of 2021 to 2024. So I've been counting my stats since 2019, but 2021 is the first year that I broke 100 books. So this is more of a even playing field with the number of books I read. In 2021, I read 114, then 118, 135, and 147. Number of pages, I went from 44,700 to 45,900 to 52,500 and 56,400. And we can see over the months, me reading generally more in the summer. In 2024, I went wild in terms of pages in the second half of the year. I'm blowing myself out of the water in almost every single month in terms of pages. That's why I felt like I was running a race. I need to chill out. Then we have the genre percent over the years. So normalizing all of these, what do we see is different. Basically, I'm seeing the genres that I read the least of in 2024 ended up being a little bit bigger each, and that's kind of squishing down my other things. One of my most interesting graphs, in my opinion. The YA versus adult percent over the years. Not only have I decreased the number of YA books that I've read on almost every single year, the percent has also gone down. So it's gone from 31, 26, 27 to 17, and it's gone down from 28% down to 11.6. I don't think I'll ever totally stop reading YA, but it's just not something I'm gravitating towards anymore as I'm getting older. Then we have star rating percent. 5 is at the top, 1 is at the bottom. This is the biggest percent that 3 stars have ever had at 42% of my reading. That's ridiculous. We have author intersectionality percent over the years. So I have broken this down into white cishet authors, white queer authors, non-white cishet authors, and non-white queer authors. I like keeping an eye on the different identities of authors to make sure I am picking up from different diverse voices. And you know, I'm not doing as great as I was at the halfway point of this year. This graph looked very different. This is just self-reporting of the authors. Do they put out online the things that they identify as? 50% of my reading being white cis-het authors, at least presumably, which is a lower percent than in any year. Annual average rating over the years. In 2023, I started using quarter stars instead of in the past, I only used whole stars on my spreadsheet. We can see in the dark green what my star rating would be if I had used the whole stars. And the light green is how much extra I'm getting from having quarter stars. And so you can see, if I was doing whole stars, my star rating this year would be 3.45. But since I'm doing quarter stars, it actually appears as a 3.63. If I was using the same metric for all 4 years, this would actually be my worst average rating year. Then we have the medium red over the years. We see my ebooks are going way down because I just don't prefer to read them. Audiobooks are staying almost exactly the same, and physical is making up for those ebook differences. Then ownership percent over the years. In 2023, I moved away from the library system that I've been at my entire life. So the number of library books that I read went down, but now I've been using it more in 2024, which is great. And ARC percent over the years, it stayed pretty consistent around that, I don't know, like 7% mark. Then we have the series stats. Bottom is standalones and top is series, first to conclusions and companions. It looks like the number of series I'm picking up in every year is about the same. It looks like I read fewer first books in series this year, but I really just was picking up a lot of standalones. Then we're gonna look at my monthly stats. We can see that I generally raised my average number of books. You can kind of see that skewing on pages as well. My number one in terms of books was 16 books, and my number one in terms of pages was July with 5,823 pages. This line right here is the number of 5 stars that I read in a month, and yes, I had 3 5 stars in May, and I believe all 3 of those books ended up making it onto my best books of the year list. Then we have genre by month. I like switching things up. The only month that I really dominated with one genre was in September. I got a lot of fantasy books coming in from the library at the same time. My audiobooks kind of don't change as much per month as my number of physical books does, which I also think just comes down to the length of the book. Average star rating per month. Let's go May. January, February, or March, I was coming off of a 6-month-long slump without a proper 5-star, and that was all below a 3.5, so I was glad to get kind of into the groove of things. Ownership by month, the stuff that I own is at the bottom. In September, again, you can see I got a lot of those library holds in. Demographic over the months, that's adult, Y is at the top. Star ratings per month. This first graph right here shows the green line is how many books I read off of my shelf, the purple line is how many books I added to my shelf, and the gray line is how many I unhauled from my TBR. All of this is TBR related. And this is just what my net status at every point in the month was. As you can see, I stayed in the negatives. This is 0 up at the top here. And then this is my monthly TBR statuses. So right here we have what my TBR is every month. And yes, I do have a perfect score because I love doing that. I love sticking to a monthly TBR. The gray is what my TBR was. The purple was how many I actually read from that TBR, and those are the same line because I have a perfect score. And the total read that month is the green line. Genre stats. This is the same graph from before. This is the different genres in terms of what their star ratings are. Since I read a lot of fantasy, you can expect my spread to be a little bit better, but you can actually see romance, not it this year. Medium by genre, I read fantasy mostly physically, general fiction, romance, and nonfiction. And classics, actually, I'm kind of reading more on the audiobooks, or maybe 50-50. This is the same graph, but only the adult books, and this is the same graph, but only the YA. We have the recommendation source by genre, so where am I getting this from? You can see author and series in fantasy is going to be a big deal, and also in romance because I'm very picky about them, so I do kind of stick to the authors that I already know. But I was getting a lot of recommendations for nonfiction and mystery, thriller, horror from the community. Then we have the pages read by genre, so you can see I read a lot of fantasy and also mystery, thriller, horror. You can actually see that in this pie chart down here, where this slice is a little bit bigger than my regular books read. Average star rating per genre, speculative and historical fiction were high, but we can also see I read fewer of those. Fantasy, I can expect that to be kind of low because I'm trying out a bunch of different things, and romance was a flop this year, average rating of 3.18. Number hauled per genre, this kind of matches how much I read, but the romance, That's too high of a number for the amount of romance I read. That needs to not happen. And then we have stuff about the authors by different genres. So we have that intersectionality of the author again. Then we have gender identity by the genre. So I do tend to read more women than men. And I do have the trans umbrella as its own category here. We're mostly seeing that in the science fiction and mystery thriller horror categories. And then author familiarity. So nonfiction and speculative fiction and general fiction are mostly authors that were new to me, but authors that I'm sticking to are fantasy, mystery, thriller, horror, and romance. And also science fiction. I read more science fiction than were read before. And these colors at the top are authors that I read more than once in the year. Then we have my author stats page. So I read 138 authors in 2024. Every time I read a book, I'm gonna put the stuff in about the author. So if I read from an author more than once in the year, they are going to appear more than once on this. It's just how I decided to do it because I wanted to see more about the books that I'm reading than the authors individually. Author identity, we have 94 female authors, that's 63%, 44 male authors, that's 30%, and 9 authors who identify under the trans umbrella. Author familiarity, 87 of the books that I read this year were from authors that were new to me. 50 of them were from authors that I had read before 2024. I had 2 books that I repeated the author and they were new this year. And I had 7 books that I repeated the author, but I had read them before 2024. So these 7 authors are in here and these 2 authors are in here. And then I had a singular reread this year, which was Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. Author ethnicity, a lot of white people. That is indicative of how the publishing industry works, but I definitely want to work on naturally reading some more diverse identities. So I have a lot of different ethnicities over here. You can see my biggest chunks after that are authors who identify as Black and authors who identify as East Asian. I do have a mixed category somewhere in here, but sometimes that's harder to find. Author queer identities, again, we have those 9 authors who identified as under the trans umbrella, 30 authors that identified online as them being queer, and then otherwise we have 117 books from authors who do not identify that way online. And then we have a bunch of conjunction stats of all of those things. If you want to take a longer look at this, you can. I don't think this will be that interesting to anybody but me, so we'll skip. Collection stats. Owned books read by medium, we have more physical than audiobook. Genres here for my owned books, and we can also see how much I read off my shelf versus how much I hauled. And the haul here includes books that I had already read before. Then we have breaking those stats down by physical, ebooks, I didn't have any that I owned, and audiobooks, same thing here. In physical books, I read a lot of different stuff, but in audiobooks, I really do stick to 4 genres: fantasy, mystery, thriller, horror, science fiction, and romance. And that is mostly because these are the books that I am not finding at my library's audiobook thing. So my taste doesn't necessarily align with what my catalog has at my library in terms of audiobooks. Then we have books hauled. This is just looking at my haul stats by medium, by genre. We can see fantasy and mystery, thriller, horror are a little bit more exaggerated. Read status, we saw that before. Sources of books hauled, this is a little bit interesting. Where did I get the books from? We have big bookstores, that's Books A Million and Barnes & Noble. Secondhand, those are used bookstores or little free libraries. Personal gifts, people gave me stuff. From the publisher, those are specifically ARCs sent to me. And then book boxes and subscriptions, that is my Book of the Month, Aardvark, and Audible subscriptions. I no longer have Aardvark, but I'm thinking of getting back together with them because they actually did have a lot of good stuff in 2024. I just had too many subscriptions that I need to get rid of. Then I had my money spent on the collection per medium, $409 on physical and $163 on audiobooks. Then books hauled per month. In March, I don't know. I think I went on a used book buying binge in March. In May, it was my birthday. In December, sales, used bookstore, and Christmas. And then lastly, we're going to look at my series stats. I do actually have this put into, as you can see here, my regular spreadsheet, but this wasn't sufficient enough for me. So I decided to make an entirely different spreadsheet about my series. This is what it looks like. It's not pretty, but it's way more functional than what I have built into the other one. So I'm just going to show you the graphs of what I did, and we can talk about what I saw in my series. So at the beginning of 2024, I had 51 series that I was in the middle of. And by the end of 2024, I had 52 that I was in the middle of, which I hate that I'm one off, but it's fine. Of the 51 series that I had on my sheet before 2024, 8 of them I finished in 2024. 3 of them I decided to DNF in 2024, and 40 of them I decided to continue in 2024. So those 40 move on to that 52 list, and there are 12 series that I started in 2024 that I have decided, at least at this point, to continue in. There were 10 series that I decided to DNF. A lot of those were series that I started in 2024. There were 8 series that I finished, and there are 13 that I am caught up on. The rest of them, 39, I am behind on. How many of the series that I have on my spreadsheet did I read from this year? 60% of the series that I had on my spreadsheet, I read from in 2024. Then we can see the genres in all these different categories. Almost all of these are about 50% fantasy. Every single series in the list, only the ones I'm currently working on, only the ones from before 2024, only the series that I started in 2024, and only the series that I read from in 2024. So that includes series that I continued in. Then we can look at the past series stats. So I've taken out all the books that I DNF'd, and we can see that there are 20 series I did not touch in 2024, and I am behind on. There are 6 that I did not read from because I am already caught up. There are 10 that I read and I'm behind on, and there are 12 that I read and I caught up on or I finished. 8 of the series that I started before 2024 had a 2024 installment. And then we can see how my relationship with the series changed. 17 of the series that I started before 2024, I improved my standing on. I read at least one more book than was published. For 30 of the series, I had a net 0. Either I didn't read it or I read the same amount that were published. There were 3 that I became more behind on. I was already behind, now I'm more behind. There's just 1 that I became behind on. Then we have the current series stats. So only the ones I'm currently working on. This is the 52. I've taken out the books that I finished and the ones that I DNF. 13 of them I'm caught up on. 17 of them I am 1 book behind publication. 11 I'm 2, 4 of them I'm 3 books behind, and 7 of them I'm more than 4 books behind. Then we have the ownership. There are 6 sequels that I own that I could get to right now. The rest of them I don't own because they aren't out yet or I just don't own them. Then we have the length of the series. Almost 50% are trilogies, but it's pretty split between the rest of them. Publication status, exactly 50% of the series that I'm in the middle of are completed and the rest of them are still being published. Lots of fantasy in the current, and then we have, again, a quarter exactly of the series that I am currently working on, I'm caught up on. Then we have the standing in the series from what I read in 2024. 45% of the books I read in series this year were the first book in a series, 15 of them were sequels, and 8 of them were conclusions. Then we have the status of just the books I read in 2024. 12 of them I started and I'm planning on continuing. 14 I continued in and I'm planning on continuing in. 8 of them I finished and 8 of them I DNF'd. Did I read from the series across the different genres? Fantasy, I have a lot of backlists that I didn't touch, but I actually got way through a bunch of the science fiction that I have in there. Then of the series that had 2024 releases, did I read them? 5 of them I did read. 8 of them I did not, and partially that's not my fault because a lot of them came out at the end of the year. And then DNFs in 2024, did I read them? 7 of them were series that I started this year and didn't like the first book enough to continue. 1 of them was from a series that I continued in 2024 and decided not to finish, and 2 of them I did not read this year. I just realized I didn't have enough interest to continue. And the last one is maybe the most boring graph on here. Is it a regular series or is it a companion series? 11 of those books being companions, that's 15%. I think that's all the stats I want to share with you today, so thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more stat-related things, I am always talking about my stats, and definitely subscribe and hit the bell if you want to hear when I have my 2025 reader spreadsheet out available for you. I'd love to know how you keep track of your reading. Do you have anything that you keep track of that I don't? I'd love to see if there's anything new that I should be adding to my spreadsheet. But again, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to find me anywhere else on the internet, you can find me at the singular link in the description, and as always, I will see you in the next one.